Welcome to the Invested Dads Podcast, simplifying financial topics so that you can take action and make your financial situation better. Helping you to understand the current world of financial planning and investments, here are your hosts, Josh Robb and Austin Wilson.
All right. Hey. Welcome back to the Invested Dads Podcast, a podcast where we take you on a journey to better your financial future. Today, we are going to be discussing geopolitics and the impact on investors specifically as it relates to kind of something that's been going on, and that is...
I don't know. What's going on?
I don't know. You were napping.
I fell asleep recently.
Yeah, if you recall the episode where we revealed the winner of last year's stock draft, Josh was asleep. So we'll link that in the show notes, just so Josh
sometimes you go 110%. You just need a break.
I know. So anyway, Russia has since invaded Ukraine.
Yes.
Which is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big deal, and I think we should probably dig into what's going on a little bit.
And we're going to take this approach. We're going to talk about what's going on, talk through things, but we're looking at it from a standpoint of here in the U.S. as two investment professionals, but we're going to talk about this geopolitical thing going on, but then also how does that impact investors, especially investors here in the U.S.
Yeah,
which is where we're at.
Absolutely. So Russia and Ukraine together,
yes,
they have a very storied past, like many years of history, both good and bad. But generally speaking, it's been mostly bad. So Russia has been pretty terrible to Ukrainians over the course of history. They've forced them to be more and more Russianized, I guess, using quotes. I don't know if that's a word.
Air quotes
over time.
On podcast.
And they've actually invested heavily and placed actual Russian people over time into Ukraine so that it seems more Russian than Ukrainian. So it's an interesting past and not a great one. There's been blood, battles, lots of disagreements, nuclear wars not nuclear, actual wars, but nuclear drama. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But that is what's been going on there. And then you look at the Russian side of things. So Russia's really been a sham since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. You know, it was rebirthed after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War and really made to look like a democracy from the outside. So it was kind of designed,
people are elected.
They were quote unquote elected. There were votes cast, all these things. But Vladimir Putin is far from a democratically elected president. He's a really power-hungry dictator who really will stop at nothing to further his own agenda. And the sad part of this is that it can even be, and this is kind of a history of Russia thing, but even to the detriment of their own people, these Russian leaders have a history of not doing things to benefit their people, but really to benefit themselves and their own agenda.
Yep.
So that's not good. But that's what's going on. But we should probably kind of talk about why Ukraine is so important for Russia. So look at why it's appealing for Russia to be doing what they're doing.
Yep.
Part of it is illogical from a economic perspective, because as we're going to talk about, their economy is being destroyed.
Yep.
Their markets have been destroyed. Their currency's been destroyed. Their people's savings are zero. You know, it's just not good, right? So Vladimir Putin actually has a personal vendetta for Ukraine because his brother was killed in a conflict there when he was very young. And this has scarred, Putin for his entire life, really.
Yep.
And you couple that with the fact that he really views Ukraine as a very important buffer state between Russia and Europe for safety and security and Russia's own economic stability, and you get a bad recipe.
Yep.
A recipe for tension. And then I guess a bigger point that affects more people than just Putin is that Russia is a huge net oil exporter worldwide. They drill a crap ton of oil.
Yep.
And really second in geographical area only to the Middle East. So
lots of oil reserves. Yeah.
Lots and lots of oil. So much of this oil goes to Europe and fuels their oil needs.
Yep. It's oil and natural gas.
Yes,
right?
exactly. So the real question is, where are the ultra important pipelines located to get all this oil from Russia to Europe?
It's right there in Ukraine.
It's right there in Ukraine. Literally
goes straight through them.
Almost all of the oil and natural gas that Europe uses comes through Ukraine from Russia.
Yep.
So that's kind of a big deal there. So theoretically, if Russia can control these pipelines, they can then control the supply of oil and natural gas and therefore control prices more, which therefore would boost their oil-dependent economy.
Yeah.
So that's why Ukraine is so important for Russia. Again, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. I think also Vladimir Putin has had this thought that since the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union was dismantled in 1991, that that was wrong. He feels like the Soviet Union was wronged in this. And he feels that from that standpoint, all of these areas that were part of the Soviet Union should be part of Russia now.
Yeah.
And the rest of the world does not feel that way at
There's
all.
a lot of like stands
Yeah.
that are countries that have the word stand in them that are their own independent country.
But
And
they
he
were
says,
part of the USSR.
that should all be mine.
It should all be Russia, right?
Yeah.
And speaking of that, so there's a little area south, also it's on the Black Sea, called Crimea, if that rings a bell.
It does.
2014,
Not too long ago.
Not too long ago, 8 years ago, Russia, they did what they...
Borrowed it?
Yeah, they quote-unquote annexed Crimea.
Yeah.
And again, similar to what is going on in Ukraine over time, Russia had heavily Russian influences in Crimea over time. But the reality is that they just wanted it because they have great access
port.
to the Black Sea.
Yeah.
It's a great port. So Russia, quote-unquote, annexed it, but they invaded it as well and took it over and made it essentially part of Russia or under Russian control anyway for their own benefit. So this has happened before.
Yep.
Ironically, this also happened, I believe, in another year of a Winter Olympics, during the Winter Olympics.
Oh, yeah.
Like, this is kind of all started during the Olympics this year.
Weird.
I think 8 years ago, it was also during the Winter Olympics did it again.
Weird.
So weird.
The idea of that is just, oh, that's nice. I want that.
It's
I'm gonna
2022.
take it.
Can we just go take things when we want them?
Yes, you can, apparently.
That would be like, not saying this is ever on the table, but that's
No.
like the U.S. going to like a part of Canada and be like, yeah, I want,
I like
that's
that.
going to be, that's now part of America
Yeah.
again. I'm like,
Yep.
you can't just do that.
Yeah.
So anyway, that
Or
is-
Cancun. We got a lot of tourists there. We're going to take Cancun and call it ours.
Or Cuba. Ooh.
And
That's pretty close to Florida. Come
Yeah,
on.
it's right there.
All right, so let's talk about some impacts. So first off, Russian stocks have sold off like 50-some%.
Yes.
Actually, they closed their stock market in
It's
fears
just
that it
stopped
would go
trading.
down
Yeah.
further.
Just said, no,
Yeah.
we're done.
So Russian stocks have sold off as the economic uncertainty of a completely unnecessary war is factored into asset prices. Stocks hate uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty there.
Not just U.S. stocks.
Not just U.S. stocks, global stocks. Russian bonds, they've sold off as a higher chance of Russian default is high. Because if the government does not have access to money, which we're going to talk about soon, and their economy is not doing well, and they're spending a bunch of money on a war that isn't needed,
default.
they could not have the money to pay their debt obligations. So Russian bonds have sold off, which what's that do to interest rates? It sends them up.
Interest rates go up when bond prices go down.
Ironically, we're going to talk about in a second, their ruble, so that the Russian currency is called the ruble.
Ruble.
It's just fallen like pieces of ruble in value, again, because of the uncertainty. People are very fearful that the value of the country's reserves, especially in light of global central bank disconnection, which we're going to talk about, that has really devalued the currency there. And a lot of what's going on is that that's going to cause the value of their currency is lower. That's going to cause really high levels of inflation. So what did the Russian central bank do over the weekend, the last weekend of February? They increased their overnight lending rate to banks from 9.5%, which is very high when you're
high.
considering ours is zero,
Zero.
to 20% overnight
So they're charging banks 20%
lending.
for the overnight holding of the assets.
Yeah. So lending, yeah, it's
So
pretty
they're
rough.
just slowing down inflation is what they're
That's
doing
exactly
here. Okay,
what
I
they're
got
doing.
you. It's really just they said, "Oh, yeah, we're going to raise our overnight lending rates."
Yeah,
for
and people have
inflation."
actually been like making runs on banks to get their money out of banks, trying to get into dollars if at all possible, because dollars are a lot more stable. And that's only further devaluing the currency as they're having to sell the ruble in its devalued state, further devaluing it.
Now, cryptocurrency, we've talked about
Oh,
this
yeah.
in the past. One of the arguments for cryptocurrency is this decentralized, not affiliated with governments type of thing. Now, how can that play into all this? I know that there's limitations in Russia. The government's put on limitations. And again, if you're buying things using the local currency, you can only do so amount of trades per day in that currency. And so it's not like you can quickly move your wealth even into a digital currency, which is still volatile.
Oh, yeah.
But you don't have to have that fear of your, hard currency.
Yes.
They just can't do that quickly.
Both Ukraine and Russia have restrictions on cryptocurrency. Ukraine, actually, prior to some of their more recent restrictions, was like the number 3 adopter of crypto in the world.
wow.
But I think that's gone down a little bit as of late. But Russia, yes, they have strict rules on how much and what and all this stuff you can do. So that puts a little bit of the kibosh. I love that word. On citizens actually taking rubles effectively and turning it into something else to being able to transact. And that is not necessarily good for citizens because they're watching the value of their Russian rubles.
Can't do anything about it.
They can't. They're just stuck with them, right? So that is kind of an issue that is happening as well. So then when you talk about actual people impact, right? Because obviously there is a war going on. There's a people impact to this.
Yes.
Russian people are protesting this war, and they literally all over the country. There's big protests going on because they feel that it's a terribly stupid, unnecessary invasion. Right? These people's economy, by no fault of their own, is going to tank. It's going to tank.
Yep.
It's going to take years and years to recover, and a lot of lives are going to be lost. And people are wondering for what, right?
Yeah.
For what purpose? And no one has an answer for that except for Vladimir Putin. And that's kind of the issue of what is behind all this.
Yeah. So that's kind of underlying aspect. What's going on? So the U.S., European Union, NATO, there's some groups that are looking at trying to be involved with this, and there's some limitations on what they're willing to do.
Yeah.
So let's walk through that. What are some of the things we've seen other countries do as sort of sanctions on this?
So there's this international monetary movement group called SWIFT. And
for how fast these transactions happen.
And it actually isn't that swift because it actually took place started in the 70s.
Yeah.
But what it actually does is it facilitates the transfer of financial information across borders, and that helps the flow of money.
Being in our industry,
yes.
when one organization communicating with another, so, if you are Schwab and you're communicating with TD Ameritrade, you have two different systems. They're not necessarily compatible. This is set up to say, okay, we'll help you guys communicate. Yes, we'll help you guys get your transaction done.
Exactly.
All right.
So that is called SWIFT.
Yep.
And most banks and financial institutions around the world are on this system to be able to facilitate inter-country financial transfers and stuff like that, information and stuff like that. Well, almost all banks, so from the European Union, most of other countries in the world have cut off SWIFT access to, I think, all but two major Russian banks. So they are not able to do that.
Can't do anything.
To transact internationally, essentially, which means they're only running on the assets that they have on hand. That's not good. And a lot of that is ruble denominated, by the way, because it's
getting devalued.
And that's getting devalued as well. However, a caveat is that oil companies as of now have not been affected by the SWIFT.
And there's a reason for that.
Because they want the flow of oil to continue.
Yeah.
Europe does.
The European Union,
they need their
Europe
oil.
is like, hey, if you stop these transactions, we're in the middle of winter and we need some oil and energy. We need natural gas. Okay, gotcha.
So there's also sanctions on a specific group of high-ranking people, which means that they pretty much can't do anything with their assets. And they're going to they probably don't need access to money. They can do whatever they want. But all the people that are really close to Putin, specifically, there are sanctions on them and what they are able or not able generally to do with their assets as well.
How I picture this in my head is there's a person that follows these people around, and every time they pull their wallet out to buy something, they slap their hand.
No.
They just slap their hand and knock the money out.
Yep.
That's really what's happening.
That's exactly what's happening, I think. So that is another group of sanctions. A couple of the impacts of this is the oil prices.
Yep.
Despite the flow of money for oil companies still being available for now, oil prices are going to continue to be high because of the uncertainty on the supply of oil coming from Russia.
Yep. So you mentioned the other big supplier is the
Middle East, essentially.
Yeah, the group of all that. I don't know what
OPEC.
you call it. OPEC. Yep, that's the word for it.
Oil-producing economic countries.
Yes.
Yeah.
But they have their own kind of problems in that they can adjust their supply to some extent, but they're running at pretty full capacity.
Yeah.
They just upped their supply just recently. Yep. So it's not like they could just say, hey, we're only giving 50% that they can't offset.
They can't make up for it.
What Russia is doing.
True. Which puts supply down.
They could get some more, but they're really just diverting it from somewhere else and readjusting.
Yeah, so what this does is it brings the overall supply available down, and the demand's still static or growing as the global economy recovers, which puts upward pressure on prices, as we've just seen both Brent and WTI, two different ways to look at oil, but both Brent and WTI have crossed $100 per barrel recently. Now they've pulled back a little since. But
Brent was telling me the other day that he thinks oil prices will.
Brent was?
Yeah, Brent. So, yeah.
Another impact of kind of what's going on is there's going to be a continued push to greener alternatives to make this not happen in the future. So if you're using more even nuclear which is ironic because Chernobyl is in Ukraine.
Yeah, I heard there's
And I've heard that their radiation levels have actually gone up since Russia took control of Chernobyl.
Yeah, they took it over.
And the radiation levels have gone up since Russia got there.
I don't know what that means.
How does that happen?
They turned.
What have they done?
They've been pushing buttons.
Yeah, what have they done? But push for greener alternatives are going to be more in demand. So things like wind and solar and things like that, especially in Europe, as they're more dependent on Russia. Even in the U.S., that is going to be a huge push because I don't know if anyone really thinks about it, but over the last handful of years, through administrative changes and stuff, we've become a little bit less fossil fuel friendly in terms of approving pipelines to transfer oil and stuff like that.
We were exporters.
We were a net exporter and energy independent.
Yep.
And that has since changed. Now we're re-importing oil. And where are we buying some oil from?
Russia.
We're buying oil from Russia. So that puts us in a little bit of a spot as well. Now, higher oil prices, as they are right now, is incentivizing our American oil companies to continue to explore and drill and bring new American oil online. So that's good. And that supply and demand will eventually work itself out. But we are actually proposed to, if needed, send oil to Europe from us. Yeah. So that actually could continue to put higher pressure on prices. So that is kind of where we are there. But the real question that I think we need to start with is why the U.S. has to be involved at all.
Yeah.
Because in 1991, a great year, the greatest.
It's a good year.
It's a good year. This is the year I was born.
That's it.
In 1991, when the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear weapon arsenal in the world.
That's crazy.
It did. The third largest, behind Russia and the U.S.
Yeah.
Right?
Because we just got through that fun Cold War.
Exactly. So when the Soviet Union fell, Ukraine was becoming independent. They signed an agreement that if they were to give up their nuclear arsenal, we, the United States and Europe specifically, would give them protection and support should they ever need it. So why does the U.S.
And Russia, too, I think, was part of that deal.
Yeah, that's not necessarily helping right now because they're attacking them.
I know. I'm just saying. They were there. They were saying, we'll help you, too.
Yeah. So anyway, that is why the U.S. is giving. Now, we're not necessarily sending physical troops to Ukraine right now.
Yep.
We are sending more troops to Europe in general.
Poland.
Making things like Poland, things like Germany. We have bases and presence there. So we're sending more troops there, not like bazillions, but some. And we are sending support in the form of weapons and money and things like that to Ukraine to do our help from that side.
Yep.
Ukraine itself actually has more soldiers than Russia has brought into Ukraine. So Ukraine is actually holding its own and defending itself. Now
they just don't have an air force.
They do have a limited air force.
Not much comparatively.
Some of it got exploded from Russia recently.
Yep.
But there are some Ukrainian fighter jets that are defending their...
But the size of their army, they have personnel, yes, but army size, Russia versus Ukraine, tanks, equipment, airplanes, yes. So,
and I imagine that most of their technology is Russian technology from 1990.
And all that
yeah,
stuff.
Exactly. So that's probably... They're fighting Russian stuff with Russian stuff. That is why the U.S. has to be involved. And I think it is worth pointing out that we have to talk about the elephant in the room, and that's China.
China.
We always like to talk about China.
Asian elephants are there in China.
Smaller ears.
Yeah. We talked about, I think I did. No, that was in our video about the group that was traveling around, left the reserve,
right.
and it was just like, man.
Trampling
I never
down.
found out what happened to them. They may
man.
have decided to turn around and go back. I don't know, but they were just on a rampage.
Crazy.
All
okay,
right.
so president, I'm using air quotes again.
Yes.
Xi. He's not really a democratically elected president,
Yes.
as we would assume. He's in.
Is that how you pronounce that? Xi?
Xi. Yeah.
Xi.
In a similar situation to Putin. So he says the U.S. is fueling the fire of this conflict and did so by encouraging Ukraine to join the EU and join, especially NATO. They've been a part of the EU, but join NATO before the invasion for protection, which really put Vladimir Putin in a corner.
Because they're in
viewed
NATO.
as a threat. Yes. No.
Russia?
No, Russia is not, and China is not.
But if they were in, Ukraine was in NATO, then we would be obligated to
defend and help.
Defend and push.
Even though we already were.
Yeah. Okay.
So, yes, Ukraine joining NATO made Ukraine all of a sudden a lot more threatening to Russia, and China says that Russia had no choice than to do what they're doing, which is all talk.
China.
The real kicker here is that should this Ukrainian invasion from Russia work out and be not stopped, what would that look like for China? Well, China could then think about doing the same thing with Taiwan, with Hong Kong, which are two separate entities.
Yeah. Hong Kong's kind of like this hybrid weird
Exactly.
thing now. Yep.
But China
Taiwan.
calls Taiwan Chinese, and
Yeah.
Taiwan says
Like,
they're
no,
independent.
we're our own.
So it's like a square is a square, but a rectangle is not a square. You know what I'm talking about. So anyway, this could cause some drama in Asia if this were to go unchecked, which is why it must be checked. Yeah. Oh, and another thing. If this continues and goes unchecked, this really will just lead Putin to be reinforced. That
I
he
want
can
this
do
one
this
and
with
this one,
any
this one.
other
Yeah.
Eastern European countries. I think of Slovakia and Latvia and Slovenia and all these Eastern European country
Yes.
names that are fun to say. They can just think that that's the next target because then they're just creeping in on Europe.
Yep.
Not good, man.
Slowly. Silly.
So that's my opinion on what's going on.
All right.
I'm not pro Putin. Let's just say that.
Yeah. So let's take a break. I got a dad joke for you.
I need it. I'm getting
All right.
fired up.
Since we're talking geopolitics, here it is. So I know this guy. He's a dual citizen, right? And so he kind of tells me that depending on where he's at in his house, he changes his citizenship. When he's in the kitchen, he's U.S. He's
American.
He's American. When he's in the living room, he is Canadian. And guess what he is in the bathroom? You already know Austin.
He's
don't you?
European.
He's European.
Oh, that never gets old.
Oh, I like
that never gets old.
That's where it's at.
So let's talk about why this time is different.
Yeah.
Is this time different?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh.
One thing that's new-ish is that Russia has placed their nuclear arsenal on high alert as Ukrainian defense has actually been much stronger than anticipated.
He kind of thought he was going to roll through.
Yeah, it didn't exactly happen.
Because if I remember in Crimea,
Crimea. Yeah.
that it was pretty low
Yeah.
low
It wasn't this
resistance.
level of drama.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And then on February 28th, President Biden said that Americans should not fear a nuclear war.
Okay.
So
Don't fear that.
hopefully that will help. Hopefully that will ring true. But let's talk about market performance during these situations, because this is not the first geopolitical situation we've had. It's not
Nor
going
will
to be
be the last. Yep.
So what happens? What's normal? Volatility is extremely high.
Yep.
We've seen that. There are days.
Now,
yeah.
again, we've talked about this. Volatility is not down. Volatility is movement.
Absolutely.
And we've seen both up and downward movements. In fact, let's see, what was that? Thursday's 25th and 26th. Those are some of the best movements in the market we've seen in quite some while.
Oh, absolutely.
So volatility is movement both directions.
Yeah.
And you see that a lot. Historically speaking, some of the best days are close to some of the worst days.
Absolutely.
So, yes, high volatility.
And one thing to keep in mind is that there are days and weeks when the market is very disconnected from reality. In fact, it's kind of like we saw in 2020. We're getting the worst COVID. So in March of 2020, March 20th, it was the bottom.
Yep.
From that point on, we were getting some of the worst COVID news we'd seen to that point, right? What did the market do?
It's
The
going
news
up.
kept getting worse and worse.
It's going up.
And the market just bounced off like a trampoline.
Yeah.
So it's not uncommon for these volatile times to have a very big disconnection from
part of
the
that
market to reality.
It's because they're forward looking.
They are very forward looking.
So you price in some of this stuff. So even though the news shows up, the market may have already priced that in.
Yeah.
And it's looking forward to what's next.
And that's why a lot of strategists, because this has happened before, you can look at it in various scenarios. A lot of strategists actually think that sometimes you can time the invasion day as potentially the bottom. Even though the actual war or disagreement is going to get worse for a little bit,
Yep.
the market
That's
has
it.
at that point priced in most of the bad news. And from that point on could, not always, but could get a little bit better from there. Another thing to point out is these things often fizzle out in weeks or months. They don't necessarily unless it becomes a world war,
Yep.
they don't last for years. So that is something to keep in mind. And like you had mentioned, yes, when you're going through some of these crazy volatile days, now it's big moves up, big moves down.
Yep.
The market's best days, they're often following the worst days. So that's one of the reasons, which we're going to talk about, why you really shouldn't be selling when things are choppy like they
Yep.
are. So Josh, talk a little bit from your perspective
Yep.
on what to do and what not to do
Yes.
during these uncertain situations.
Yeah. Like you just said, don't panic sell.
No.
Sell if you need cash.
Yeah.
But don't sell just because you're scared.
Yeah.
And that's part of having a plan, having a purpose, having a strategy is to say, all right, this is why I'm invested in the way I'm investing. And so don't make adjustments if they're not needed.
Yep.
Definitely don't try to time the market because, one, like you said, it could get disconnected.
Oh, yeah.
You could say, I know it should be doing this, and it may not do that.
Exactly.
You have to be perfect in getting out and getting back in, and that's a very hard thing to do. And so time in the market is just not a thing to do.
Yep.
Short-term volatility, which is what we're talking about here, is a normal part of investing.
Yeah.
This is a unique reason for it, but there's always a unique reason for it. If you pull up any stock chart and overlay that headline news, there's always a reason for volatility. Mm-hmm. And so don't let short-term volatility direct how your asset allocation is set up. Your asset allocation should be set to go through short-term volatility.
And if you have questions about that,
talk to your advisor. It's a great thing to do.
Always talk to
They're
your
always ready to talk to you.
That's right.
They're there really to help you before you try to make that panic decision.
Right.
If you have cash, the markets are down.
Yeah.
And so who knows when the bottom is? Don't try to time it.
No.
But if you have cash and the markets are down, could be a good opportunity.
Yeah, you get good business.
If you're
at a
worried
good
about
price.
timing it, then average it in. Because
Exactly.
over the long run, getting the money is more important than timing.
And technically speaking, the
Yes.
S&P 500 is officially in correction
We're in a
territory.
correction, which is 10% down.
10% down. The NASDAQ near bear market.
It hit one intraday.
Yeah, it never
Last-
closed.
like
it
a
was
week
close,
ago.
really close.
Yep.
This, I think, something to keep in mind is that we've had years of good returns, like 20+% returns. Now, that's not normal, right?
Nope.
8 to 10%
Yep.
is normal.
Yep.
These big returns that we've had have not been normal. We were already due for a pullback, and this kind of was a catalyst to get us there. This, along with the inflation and Federal Reserve discussion, these were the catalysts that got us to that correction that we were looking for. And that's a very, very healthy thing, because what markets do is they overcorrect when things get bad,
Like a
to the
pendulum.
downside.
Swing
Then
around.
they overcorrect when things get good to the upside,
Yep.
and then they have to correct back down
Yep.
to a
That's
more
just
normal
back and
long-term
forth.
trend. So it's not unusual, and we have been overdue for some sort of correction from a technical perspective for a while.
Yep.
So the question is,
Yes.
how could, now I'm not saying you should, because again, talk to your advisor,
Yep.
every situation is different, but what are some ways that you might be able to capitalize on some of these geopolitical tensions?
Now, these are not
Non-recommendations.
recommendations.
No. Yeah. Do your own due diligence on
Yep.
some of these, but these are ideas of
Ideas.
ways that have historically done okay during times of geopolitical turmoil. Not
Okay.
saying they will. There's no guarantee of future results
Yep.
based on historical ones, but these are some ideas. So individual stocks like in areas of defense names, defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, L3 Harris Technologies, Northrop Grumman. These defense names, because of militaries buying equipment
Yeah.
and things
Contracted
like that,
militaries. Yep.
those have historically done well during these times of geopolitical tensions. You can also access these through ETFs like the iShares U.S. Aerospace and Defense ETF, the Invesco Aerospace and Defense ETF, and the SPDR S&P Aerospace and Defense.
And none of those have fun tickers. So that's
No,
why
I didn't
Austin
even read the
say 'em.
tickers.
None of them are fun.
They're not fun. Other ways, now these are more unconventional. I would use them as alternatives to equities. Things like gold are typically viewed as a safe haven during times of turmoil in this area, and gold has done well during this uncertainty. And bonds are viewed as an area of safety as well, specifically United States bonds.
Yeah.
Risk-free United States bonds. Now, you're not going to get much for them, but they're
They
safe.
don't have the volatility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So those are more anti-stock ways to get a little bit of this. Some people are saying that crypto is the answer in areas like this, but it's really has not worked out to be that way.
Yeah, it's
Crypto
volatile.
has been extremely
It's
volatile. And when people are in a risk-off mood, where stocks are a notably risky asset class, they're already selling stocks. They're not selling stocks to go buy crypto.
No.
So if you're in a risk-off environment when things are choppy, people need to understand that crypto is going to be extra volatile during that time and may go down also with stocks. So Josh,
Yes.
the big question.
Yeah,
Are you ready for it?
I'm ready.
Do you know what I'm going to ask?
I know my answer even before you.
Should you buy stocks during geopolitical tensions?
It depends.
Okay. Should you sell stocks during geopolitical tensions?
That also depends.
So what should you do?
You should have a plan in place and you should stick to your plan.
Yeah.
So should you buy stocks? Yeah, if that fits in your plan
Yeah.
and you have cash coming in, yeah. Should you sell stocks? Yeah, if that fits with your plan and you have cash needing to go out. But really what it comes down to is there's always going to be uncertainty, whether it's geopolitical stuff, whatever. Your plan needs to be set up in a way where you can stick with it and reach your goals regardless of those things around it. So what should you do? Just talk to your advisor and stick to your plan.
And speaking of that plan, check out our free gift to you. It's a brief list of 8 principles of timeless investing. These are overarching investment themes meant to keep you on track to meet your long-term goals, even in the midst of geopolitical turmoil. So check it out. It's free on our website. And Josh, how can people help us to grow this podcast and help lots of people?
Yep. Make sure you subscribe. That way, every Thursday, you get it downloaded straight to however you listen to podcasts. If you have any questions, thoughts, or concerns, shoot us an email at hello@theinvesteddads.com and make sure you share the episode with your friends and family.
And a new thing that we would love is if you would subscribe and give us a rating on Spotify.
Ooh, Spotify.
Because we have a lot of listeners who utilize Spotify as their preferred podcast platform. So go ahead and give us a listen, a follow,
More people
and a
find
rating
us.
there. Yeah, that'd be great. Well, until next week, have a great week.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Invested Dads podcast. This episode has ended, but your journey towards a better financial future doesn't have to. Head over to theinvesteddads.com to access all the links and resources mentioned in today's show. If you enjoyed this episode and we had a positive impact on your life, leave us a review, click subscribe, and don't miss the next episode. Josh Robb and Austin Wilson work for Hicks & Zerker Capital Management. All opinions expressed by Josh, Austin, or any podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Hicks & Zerker Capital Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of Hicks & Zerker Capital Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast. There is no guarantee that the statements, opinions, or forecasts provided herein will prove to be correct. Past performance may not be indicative of future results. Indices are not available for direct investment. Any investor who attempts to mimic the performance of an index would incur fees and expenses which would reduce returns. Securities investing involves risk, including the potential for loss of principal. There is no assurance that any investment plan or strategy will be successful.